There is a creature lurking in Australia's rivers, lakes, and swamps that has been described by witnesses for over 200 years. It has been reported by Aboriginal people for far longer than that. Scientists have examined bones they thought might belong to it. A museum in Melbourne once put what was claimed to be its skull on public display and had to remove it 3 days later because the crowd it drew was becoming unmanageable. And to this day, nobody has conclusively proven what it is, where it came from, or whether it exists at all. If you have spent any time around Australian folklore, you have probably heard the word Bunyip. You have almost certainly heard it used as a punchline. A children's book character, a funny-sounding word that Australians deploy when they want foreigners to think everything in this country is trying to kill them, which, to be fair, is a reasonable national pastime. But here is the thing about the Bunyip that gets lost in the joke version of the story. The reports behind it are not coming from one place, one era, or one cultural tradition. They are coming from dozens of Aboriginal language groups spread across the entire southeastern quarter of the continent, from colonial settlers who had nothing obvious to gain by inventing them, from 19th century newspapers whose editors were generally more interested in selling papers than in protecting folklore, and from people in the 20th and 21st centuries who in several cases had no prior familiarity with the legend at all before reporting what they saw. That pattern does not prove a creature exists, but it does mean the Bunyip deserves considerably more serious attention than it usually gets, and what you find when you actually look closely at the history is more interesting than either the believers or the dismissers usually bother to tell you. What people actually describe? Start with the descriptions, because this is where things immediately become strange, and not strange in the way you might expect. If a large unknown animal were genuinely moving through Australia's inland waterways, you would expect witness descriptions to converge over time toward something consistent. The way that sightings of known animals, even rare ones, tend to produce a recognizable profile once enough witnesses have reported them independently, a rough agreement on size, a shared impression of shape, some consensus on color or movement. The Bunyip does not do this at all. Colonial era newspaper accounts alone describe an animal variously as having the body of a hippopotamus, the head of a dog, the tail of a horse, the flippers of a seal, the neck of an emu, and in at least one enthusiastically reported account from 1845, feathers, not fur, feathers, on a thing living in a river. The reporter appears to have written this with complete conviction, and nobody at the publication apparently felt the need to push back on it. The size descriptions are equally impossible to reconcile. Some accounts describe something roughly the size of a large dog. Others describe a creature the size of a bullock. Some witnesses report seeing something primarily below the surface, visible only as a dark mass or a disturbance in the water. Others describe an animal that reared up and was clearly observed above the waterline for several seconds. The sounds attributed to the Bunyip are almost more consistent than the physical descriptions, which is itself interesting. Across a wide range of accounts, separated by geography and era, witnesses describe a loud, bellowing roar, sometimes compared to a bull, sometimes to a large dog, occasionally described as something between a bark and a boom that carries over a considerable distance, particularly at night. Now, there are two ways to read this inconsistency. The first is the dismissive reading that the Bunyip is simply a cultural catch-all category into which frightened or confused people have been dumping unexplained things they encountered near water for 2 centuries, and that the creature's refusal to be consistently described is the clearest possible evidence that it does not exist as a single coherent animal. The second reading is more interesting, because there is actually a well-documented phenomenon in cryptozoology and in folklore studies where a genuinely real but rarely seen animal generates wildly inconsistent descriptions, precisely because witnesses are encountering it under difficult conditions. Poor light, partial visibility through vegetation or water, extreme stress, a brief sighting that the brain then has to reconstruct from incomplete information, Under those conditions, the same real animal can produce dramatically different descriptions from different witnesses. Neither reading resolves the question. Both are worth sitting with. The name that predates the settlers, the word Bunyip itself, is one of the more revealing details in this story, and it tends to get skipped over in accounts that go straight to the colonial newspaper reports. The term is generally traced to the Wemba Wemba language of what is now northwestern Victoria. In that language, the word carries meanings variously recorded as devil, spirit, or more specifically, a dangerous spirit associated with water. But the Wemba Wemba account is simply the one that happened to be documented earliest by European recorders. Accounts of a large dangerous creature or spirit associated specifically with inland water sources appear independently across dozens of Aboriginal language groups spread across Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, and Queensland. The Ngarrindjeri people of the Lower Murray and Coorong region describe a creature called the Muljawunk, associated with the Murray River and its connecting lakes. Accounts from Ngarrindjeri traditional owners describe it as dangerous, enormous, and specifically linked to certain sections of the river that should not be disturbed. The Aborigines of the Riverina district of New South Wales use separate language to describe comparable creatures in the waterways of that region. In Queensland, similar accounts attach to different river systems entirely, described through different cultural frameworks, but producing a recognizably related profile, a large, dangerous, water-associated entity that should be avoided and respected rather than pursued. The geographic spread here is significant in exactly the way that the spread of Min Min Light accounts across multiple independent Aboriginal language groups is significant. These are not communities that were in regular contact with one another across those distances. They were not in the 19th century comparing notes by telephone or by the internet for obvious reasons. The consistency of a water-associated dangerous creature appearing across such a broad and geographically separated set of Aboriginal traditions is the kind of thing that demands an explanation rather than a dismissal. Some researchers who have examined this distribution seriously have proposed that the Bunyip accounts preserve a genuine ecological memory, a warning system embedded into story and transmitted through oral tradition across thousands of years, carrying real information about real hazards associated with inland waterways. That is not a fringe position. It is consistent with what researchers studying Aboriginal oral traditions in other contexts have found repeatedly, that traditional stories can preserve accurate information about geological events, ecological hazards, and landscape features across timescales that written cultures find difficult to conceptualize. The Kuku Yalanji people, whose traditional country encompasses the Daintree region of far north Queensland, demonstrate exactly this kind of deep ecological knowledge embedded in cultural tradition. There is no particular reason the communities of southeastern Australia's river systems would have been less sophisticated in the knowledge they encoded into their own traditions about the waterways they had lived alongside for thousands of years. The warning embedded in Bunyip law is specific and consistent regardless of which language group you examine. Do not swim in certain places, do not disturb certain waterholes, approach particular river sections with care. That warning, regardless of what it was originally attached to, is not wrong. The colonial record European settlers in southeastern Australia began recording Bunyip accounts almost as soon as they arrived in significant numbers, which is either because they were genuinely encountering something in the waterways or because they had absorbed the Aboriginal warnings so thoroughly that every unexplained sound or disturbance near water immediately got assigned to the creature, possibly both. The colonial newspaper record from the 1840s and 1850s is extraordinary reading if you approach it with the right attitude, which is to say, with an appreciation for the fact that 19th century Australian journalism operated under editorial standards that can charitably be described as enthusiastic. accounts of Bunyip sightings appear in papers across Victoria and New South Wales with a frequency and a confidence that suggests editors regarded them roughly the way a modern editor might regard a celebrity sighting: plausible, entertaining, worth printing, not necessarily requiring verification, but buried within the more colourful accounts are a handful of reports that resist easy dismissal. In 1846, a man named William Buckley, who had lived with the Wathaurong people of the Port Phillip district for 32 years after escaping from a convict settlement in 1803, gave an account before his death that year of having personally observed a bunyip in the lakes and rivers of the region on multiple occasions during his decades living in that country. Buckley was a complicated figure, and his accounts deserve the same critical scrutiny as any historical source, but his 32 years of direct experience living within Aboriginal communities in that specific landscape, learning their knowledge of it from the inside rather than as an observer, gives his testimony a different character from a squatter who glimpsed something dark in a swamp at dusk and ran home to write to the newspaper about it. The most dramatic episode in the colonial record arrived in 1847. A skull was discovered near Geelong by a man named William Horden at a dried waterhole on his property. The skull was unusual enough that it was sent to William Dennison, an engineer and later colonial governor, who forwarded it to the Australian Museum in Sydney. The museum's curator at the time, William S. Macleay, examined the skull and publicly declared it to be from an unknown species. Specifically, he suggested it might represent the animal behind the Bunyip accounts. What happened next was one of the stranger episodes in the history of Australian science. The museum put the skull on public display. Within 3 days, the crowds gathering to see it had become large enough that the exhibit had to be closed. Newspapers across the colonies ran accounts of the skull as evidence that the bunyip had been scientifically confirmed. A public debate erupted that drew in scientists, squatters, and Aboriginal informants who were brought to examine the skull and asked whether it matched the creature they knew from their own traditions. The responses from Aboriginal witnesses were, depending on your point of view, either perfectly consistent with the skull being a bunyip or perfectly consistent with people being asked a leading question under significant social pressure and answering in the way that seemed expected of them. The skull was eventually re-examined and attributed, somewhat anticlimactically, to a deformed foal. The bunyip's brief moment of institutional recognition ended, the newspapers moved on. But the question of what Horden had actually found at that dried waterhole was never, strictly speaking, resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Deformed foal skulls do not typically look unusual enough to convince museum curators that they represent unknown species, and William Macleay was not an uninformed observer. What science has actually found here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, and where paleontology enters a conversation it would probably prefer to stay out of. Australia's Pleistocene megafauna, the collection of large animals that inhabited this continent until somewhere between 46,000 and 24,000 years ago, depending on the species, included several animals whose physical profile overlaps in suggestive ways with certain bunyip descriptions. The diprotodon, the largest marsupial known to have existed anywhere on Earth, reached the size of a large rhinoceros. It was semi-aquatic, inhabit, associated with lakes and river systems, and widespread across exactly the regions of southeastern Australia where bunyip accounts are most concentrated. Its skull, viewed by someone unfamiliar with it, is unusual enough to have prompted genuine confusion when fossil specimens began turning up in the 19th century. Several paleontologists examining the bunyip question have noted that a diprotodon-like animal, even one glimpsed only partially through vegetation or in poor light at a waterhole, could plausibly produce descriptions consistent with at least some of the bunyip accounts in the colonial record. The standard scientific position is that the diprotodon went extinct well before European settlement and therefore cannot account for colonial era or modern sightings. This is almost certainly correct. Almost certainly is doing some work in that sentence. There is a separate and more recently examined candidate, the Palocestes, a marsupial with a physical profile that several researchers have described as startlingly consistent with certain Bunyip descriptions, particularly those emphasizing a long snout, a heavy body, and large claws. The Palocestes was also associated with waterside habitats and also went extinct during the Pleistocene megafauna collapse. Its skull, when unearthed, is unusual enough that early European colonists who encountered Palocestes fossils were genuinely uncertain what they were looking at. And there is a third candidate that most accounts of the Bunyip question skip entirely. The Australian fur seal and the leopard seal are both known to make occasional appearances in southeastern Australian river systems far further inland than most people expect. Seals have been documented moving significant distances up the Murray-Darling River system. A seal encountered unexpectedly in an inland waterhole, particularly at night, by a witness with no prior experience of seeing one in that context, is entirely capable of producing a description of something large, dark, loud, and completely unidentifiable. Seals, it turns out, make sounds at night that are genuinely unsettling, even when you know exactly what is making them. The honest scientific position on the Bunyip is not that the creature definitely does not exist. It is that no physical specimen has been produced and examined under controlled conditions. That is a different statement. It is also the only statement the evidence strictly supports. The waterways themselves. To understand why Bunyip accounts keep being generated, you need to understand what the inland waterways of southeastern Australia are actually like. Because if you are picturing a placid, clear river where a large, unknown animal would be difficult to miss, you have not spent time in the Murray-Darling Basin. Australia's inland river systems are among the most ecologically complex and physically unpredictable waterways on the planet. The Murray-Darling Basin covers over 1 million square kilometres. Its rivers change character dramatically between wet and dry seasons, expanding into broad, turbid flood systems where visibility through the water column is essentially zero, then contracting into isolated waterholes and billabongs that can persist for months as separate environments entirely disconnected from the main river channel. The vegetation along the banks of these systems, the river red gums, the lignum swamps, the dense stands of cane grass, creates environments where a large animal could move with genuine concealment. These waterways already contain animals that most visitors do not expect. Freshwater crocodiles inhabit river systems in Queensland and the Northern Territory. Large Murray cod, Australia's biggest freshwater fish, can exceed 1.8 metres in length and weigh over 100 kilograms. They have been in these rivers for millions of years and are genuinely startling when encountered unexpectedly. Platypus, which you would think nobody could mistake for a monster, and yet were themselves initially dismissed as a hoax when specimens first reached European scientists, inhabit the same waterways where Bunyip accounts are most frequent. The point is not that any of these animals is the Bunyip. The point is that these are waterways where genuinely surprising things happen regularly and where the conditions for misidentification, partial sighting, and complete perceptual confusion are built into the environment itself. A large, dark, partially submerged animal moving through a turbid billabong at dusk in country, this remote is not going to photograph itself conveniently. The absence of a confirmed specimen does not mean the absence of something generating the sightings that refuse to stop. If the Bunyip were a purely 19th century phenomenon, a colonial era confusion of Aboriginal warnings with megafauna fossils and panicked settlers, you would expect the accounts to thin out as Australia modernised, electrified, and populated its inland river systems with people who owned cameras. They have not thinned out. They have changed character somewhat, the way the Min Min light accounts changed character as the century changed, but they have not stopped. In 1954, a woman named Miss M. Doris Burrell submitted a formal account to the Victorian Naturalist Journal describing an encounter at Euroa in central Victoria. She described an animal approximately the size of a large dog with a black coat, moving along a creek bank before entering the water and disappearing. She was specific about details. She had a clear sighting in adequate light. She submitted the account to a scientific publication rather than a tabloid newspaper, which tells you something about how seriously she was taking what she saw. Through the 1970s and 1980s, accounts continued to emerge from the river systems of Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia. A pattern emerged in the reports that several researchers found worth noting. The sightings were clustering around specific waterways rather than being distributed evenly across the landscape. Certain sections of the Murray system, certain lakes in the Western District of Victoria, certain river reaches in the Riverina region of New South Wales appeared repeatedly in the accounts in a way that did not look random. In 2001, a group of researchers associated with the Centre for Fortean Zoology conducted a field investigation in the Victorian Western District, specifically following up on a cluster of recent sighting reports. They documented fresh accounts from local residents who had observed large unidentified animals in and around several lakes in the area. None of these accounts produced physical evidence that could be formally examined. None of them made it into peer-reviewed literature, but the researchers noted that the witnesses were not the kind of people who seemed to be embellishing or seeking attention. Several had not reported their sightings publicly at all before being contacted. More recently, in 2019, a couple camping near a remote section of the Murray in New South Wales reported waking to a sound they described as an enormous bellowing roar coming from the river. Neither of them had prior familiarity with the Bunyip legend. One of them, when later describing the encounter to a local, was shown a recording of a male koala's mating call, which is one of the more legitimately alarming sounds produced by any animal in this country, and which does not sound remotely like what people expect a koala to make. The witness said it was similar, but considerably larger. That account has not been resolved. What the stories are actually doing? Spend enough time with the Bunyip literature, and a pattern emerges that is more interesting than the creature question itself. Across the Aboriginal traditions that preserve Bunyip accounts, the stories are not simply scary stories about a monster in the water. They are carrying specific, verifiable, ecologically accurate information about the waterways they are attached to. The waterholes and river sections most consistently associated with Bunyip danger in Aboriginal traditions tend to be the same sections of waterway that are genuinely most dangerous, deep holes with unpredictable currents, sections of river where the bottom drops suddenly and where drowning risk is genuinely elevated, waterways adjacent to crocodile habitat in the north, areas where dense underwater vegetation creates entanglement hazards that non-swimmers or inexperienced swimmers cannot identify until it is too late. The Bunyip warning, stripped of the creature itself, functions as a precise and accurate hazard marker. Do not enter here. This water will kill you. The warning is not dressed up in abstract prohibition. It is attached to a specific, memorable, emotionally compelling entity that ensures the warning will be remembered, repeated, and taken seriously across generations. That is not primitive superstition. That is extraordinarily sophisticated ecological knowledge transmission using the same basic architecture that public health campaigns have spent the last 50 years trying to figure out how to replicate effectively. Researchers working at the intersection of Aboriginal studies and ecological management have made this point repeatedly in recent years. Traditional ecological knowledge embedded in stories, particularly stories with strong emotional content attached to specific locations, has demonstrably preserved accurate environmental information across timescales that no written record has ever matched. The Bunyip tradition is one of the most geographically extensive examples of this on the continent, which raises an uncomfortable question for anyone wanting a clean resolution to the Bunyip mystery. If the Bunyip story was always primarily a vehicle for transmitting accurate ecological knowledge about the dangers of specific waterways, does it actually matter whether the creature itself ever existed? The knowledge it was carrying was real. The warnings it encoded were accurate. The communities that maintained it survived in these landscapes sustainably for tens of thousands of years before anyone arrived to build a fence near the riverbank or take a photo of whatever was making that noise. The creature question is fascinating, but it might also be the less important question. The honest conclusion. Here is where this story actually sits, as of right now. No verified physical specimen of a bunyip has ever been produced and examined under controlled scientific conditions. No photograph, no video, no DNA sample, no skeleton, no confirmed track cast has ever been accepted by mainstream science as evidence of an unknown large animal inhabiting Australian waterways. That is the position the evidence supports, and there is no honest way around it. At the same time, the history behind the bunyip is not a history of credulous fools frightening each other around campfires. It is a history of independent Aboriginal traditions spread across an enormous geographic area, producing consistent accounts of a water-associated creature or spirit that predates European settlement by an unquantifiable margin. It is a history of colonial witnesses, including experienced bushmen, medical practitioners, and museum curators engaging seriously with something they could not explain. It is a history of fossil evidence that, without proving the creature's continued existence, demonstrates that animals whose physical profile overlaps with certain bunyip descriptions genuinely did inhabit the waterways of southeastern Australia and may have survived long enough to have been encountered by the continent's first peoples. The Diprotodon was real. The Palakestes was real. The ecological memory embedded in Aboriginal oral traditions has been demonstrated in other contexts to preserve accurate information across timescales of tens of thousands of years. None of that proves the bunyip is real. All of it means the question is worth taking more seriously than the punchline version of the story allows for. And then there is the straightforwardly unresolved part. People are still reporting something, not frequently, not in ways that generate the kind of evidence science requires, but consistently enough across a wide enough geographic spread from witnesses with diverse enough backgrounds and no obvious motive for fabrication that the simplest dismissive explanation that everyone reporting a bunyip encounter is simply mistaken or making it up requires you to believe something about human testimony in general that the evidence does not quite support. The Murray-Darling Basin covers an area larger than France and Spain combined. Its waterways are turbid, complex, seasonally unpredictable, and in significant portions still genuinely remote. The idea that every large animal inhabiting that system has been catalogued, confirmed, and understood is not a claim that the ecology of those waterways actually supports. Australia has a documented history of surprising its scientists. The platypus was a hoax until it was not. The coelacanth was extinct until someone caught one off the coast of South Africa in 1938. The black-footed rock wallaby was considered locally extinct in South Australia until a population was rediscovered in 1991. This is not a continent that rewards absolute confidence about what does and does not exist within it. The bunyip is not a confirmed animal. It is not a confirmed hoax. It is a mystery with genuine depth sitting underneath the joke, attached to some of the most significant waterways on the continent, embedded in some of the oldest continuous oral traditions on Earth, and reported by enough serious people across enough separate eras that the honest position sits, as it so often does with the genuinely unresolved corners of this country, somewhere in the uncomfortable space between the two confident answers everyone keeps reaching for. Something has been seen in those waterways, something has been heard, what it is has not been settled, and the waterways where those accounts keep emerging are still out there, still complex, still dark after sunset, and still entirely capable of producing a sound at 3 in the morning that you will not be able to explain to anyone's satisfaction by daylight. The Kuku-Yalanji have a phrase that researchers working in that country have noted again and again when discussing what traditional knowledge has to say about the landscape. The knowledge is in the country, not in a book, not in an archive, in the country itself. Whatever the Bunyip is, or was, or represents, the country it belongs to has been keeping that particular secret for a very long time. And on the evidence so far, it is in no hurry to give it up. If this is the first time you have taken the Bunyip seriously as something more than a punchline, drop it in the comments, because most people who grew up in this country were handed the joke version of this story and sent on their way without ever being told about the Aboriginal traditions behind it, the fossil record underneath it, or the ecological knowledge embedded inside it. That is a significant amount of history to leave out of what is supposed to be a funny word. Subscribe now for more of the ancient, the strange, and the genuinely unresolved corners of Australia that the standard version of the story never quite gets around to. There is a lot more where this came from.